Hey Nick, welcome to and welcome audience to our third episode of Poker Reverse Engineered, where we break down poker concepts so that you can start building your friends for the rest of your life.
Nice. Do you want to start us off, Wayne?
Yeah, sure. So in the last episode, we covered a lot about pre-flop concepts, and right now we think that the next most linear jump is to go into a little bit of post-flop concepts. And how we want to do this is to build a bridge between pre-flop and post-flop. So when after pre-flop ends, right, there's the process of three cards coming out and the flop comes. So what happens when the flop actually comes? So one of the things that happens when the flop actually comes is that equity from hands get redistributed. So if I had aces pre-flop and you had pocket twos pre-flop, I had about 80%, you had about 20%. But when the flop comes out, depends on the board, the equity could change. And this is so for the equity always changes. Like either if there's no two and I don't have a straight draw, your equity goes down to something like 19%. If it's 4 outs, it's 3 outs twice, so there's 12%, so about 13%. And if you hit a set, your equity goes up, and then I have about 13% now. So that's just a brief example of how equity gets redistributed.
Quite important, really. I mean, the amount of shifts that can happen when three cards come out are pretty dramatic. It's not generally going to change who has the stronger range from starting pre-flop, but it can change the strength of a lot of hands within that range. So it would be a mistake to ignore it.
Yeah, I think the important distinction here to point out is that instead of saying the flop coming as, hey, my hand improved, think about it more like, hey, equity is redistributed. Like even if I improve, I don't always know if I have the better hand, or I'm not always gonna win when I reach showdown. But if I improve my hand, my equity goes up, and there's a higher chance I win by the end of the hand.
Yeah, and maybe it's helpful to just like give the most common example of how we will improve our equity. So if you just think about most of your hands are not going to be pairs pre-flop. The most common way you're going to improve equity to the flop is you're going to make a pair. It'll happen about a third of the time with an unpaired hand, give or take. So if you can just acquaint yourself with that being sort of the most common upgrade from pre-flop to flop, sometimes you'll make two pair plus, which is awesome when it happens. But in general, the way that you're most likely to improve from pre-flop to flop is to make one pair. And that's not always going to give you a great idea of whether or not you have the best hand or not. A lot of times it's going to put you sort of like in an unclear zone where you like your hand, but you're not willing to risk all your money with your hand. And so that sort of leads us into, I think, the next concept that we want to talk about, which is how to start to categorize different hands. Do you think this is the right direction at this point?
Yeah. So when the board comes out, right, there are, we can have a very, very good hand. Like, for example, we can flop a straight, we can flop a flush, we can flop three of a kind with a set. There are many big flops for us. And when we hit a really, really big flop, just to describe the difference between absolute hand strength and marginal hand strength is that, like, when we have a board that we have the nuts, or we have the top three nuts, so like nut number 1, nut number 2, nut number 3, where, for example, if it's a 3 hearts come out, we have the ace high flush, that would be the best. Maybe you can lead this conversation. What's the second nuts? Yeah, all right. So first nuts, second nuts, and third nuts. So if you have an ace high flush, that's the first nuts. If you have the king high flush, that's the second nuts, and the queen high flush is the third nuts, depending on whether the ace, king, and queen are on the board. And if the board came out a flush and you have a straight on that board, your straight on the flop is a very good hand, absolute strength wise, but from a comparative strength wise, comparing to the other your opponents, if there's a flush on board and you have a straight, that's not as strong of a hand. So
I think that makes sense. That basically we need to be more worried about specific hand strengths when the board allows for stronger hands to be made. So 2-pair is really good on a board where there's no straights or no flushes possible. It becomes worse on boards where straights or flushes are possible. But in general, it's a pretty good metric that the most common way your hand's going to improve is first to flop a pair, and then it's more rare to make 2-pair, even more rare to make trips, even more rare to make a straight, even more rare to make a flush, even more rare to make a full house. Quads is nearly impossible, but happens sometimes. All right, so take us down the line of once we establish the difference between the relative and the absolute value of our hand, why is it useful to know where our hand sort of falls on that spectrum? How does that help us organize our strategy?
So it helps us to organize our strategy because hands, at least there are two very, very clear buckets of hands two buckets that our hands will fit into. The first bucket of which is the nuts bucket. So hands that are extremely, extremely strong. So these are hands that, in the standard 100 big blinds or even a 200 big blinds game, usually let's say we're just talking about 100 big blinds. We are very willing to put all of our money into the pot when, I bet you raise, like I'm willing to re-raise because the hand is very, very strong. Or the example I would give is that if somebody just went all in, are you just happy to call off these hands? And there's that nuts category, that bucket. So then there's the other side of the bucket, which is the really, really weak hands. So very often time these are hands with no overcuts to the biggest cut on the board. We have no pair, we have no draw, and we're just our equity in this pot is very, very low. We are just very happy to give up this category of hands. So if we think about these two extreme ends and these two extreme buckets of hands, then in the middle, there are probably another two more buckets that I'm going to describe today. So the first is that, so if we see it as an A, B, C, D, A being the super, super nuts and D being the really, really weak hands, then B hands are probably hands that, they are kind of marginal value hands. They're quite good. We don't mind putting one or two bets into the pot by the end of or maybe even three bets in the pot by the flop, turn, and river. But we don't want to be we're not very excited to keep putting money in. So if somebody bets, we just want to call. These are often times when we have one pair, maybe a top pair, sometimes some second pair. And because we think of things in terms of equity, right? So if this B category is hands that are the good top pairs, then there's going to be a C category of hands which are maybe like some of our weaker paired hands, some of our weaker draws. So we can fit our draws, like flush draws and straight draws, probably into two categories as well. So some will fit into B, some will fit into C, and same like our pairs. So the better pairs, like if we have top pair, top kicker, that's the example of the best pair. Or if we have an over pair, like we have pocket aces, on a board there is like Jack 5-2. It's quite a good hand. Like that would definitely fit into the B category. Maybe you take it from here.
Yeah, I just thought of this, but I feel like it's relevant. So I think that's a good description of how the different categories of hands are kind of outlined. And then Wayne mentioned how everything is basically assessed based on equity. That's a good heuristic to work with. And there is a useful distinguishment between different types of equity. We could use the third and the second category. Let's isolate a strong draw and a marginal strength pair. Now, if you looked in an equity calculator, which you can do, it's a tool that's available. Basically, you would plug your hand in, you would plug all the hands that your opponents could have on the other side, and it would tell you how much equity you have in the hand, which basically means that if you stopped the hand and ran the cards out with no future bets, if you had 20% equity, it means you would win that hand 20% of the time or so. So we could imagine a situation where you have two different hand types. You have a marginal strength pair, and then in another instance, you have a draw. Those two hand strengths would run very close in equity to each other. At least we could create models where we could pick a certain pair and a certain draw that seem to have similar equity. But the expected value, we explained what EV was. I'm glad we did that in the first one. We made a clear distinguishment. The EV of those two hands could be fairly different because of the potential that those two hands have. So the important thing to realize is that the strong draw is nothing until it makes its draw. But when it makes its draw, it becomes one of the strongest hands on boards. Usually it can make a straight or a flush. And when that happens, usually it can win a very large pot. The weak pair can't really ever do that. Sometimes at a very low frequency, it'll make two pair or three of a kind, but its equity is mainly derived from when it gets to see a free showdown. That's what it's going for, basically. It's made a decent strength hand that it doesn't really want to bet a lot of or call a lot of money with. It just wants to capture the pot for as cheap as possible. So I bring this distinguishment up because I think it's a relevant one. There is a difference in the quality of equity depending if we have a marginal strength hand or a strong draw. If you look strictly at the equities, they might appear similar, but the strong draw has a lot more potential than the weak pair. And for this reason, we tend to want to be bluffing with a strong draw more than we would a weak pair, because when the strong draw makes its hand, well, now it's turned into a really strong value hand, and we want that when we arrive on a later street, because now we could win a really big pot with a really big bet. So I hope that just gives some insight on the difference between two hands that might appear to have similar equity. One term we call that hot and cold equity. Hot and cold basically just means if everything was stopped and we just ran the cards out with no future bets, this hand would win this percentage of the time. Two hands that have 25% equity could have drastically different EVs because of the quality of equity. Draw would be better in that sense.
Yeah, so from a more practical, strategic standpoint of how you can apply that into your poker game, right? Very oftentimes, if we fit things back into these four buckets, A, B, C, D, and we think about A being really, really high equity, D being almost zero equity, and then B and C being like kind of like it just goes down the scale. B is still quite high equity, C is pretty low equity, but because draws have this kind of like superpower about them, where when you improve, it improves a lot more, so you can get paid off on a later street, right? A lot of times you can play your draw as if it is kind of like almost like if it's like one category higher. So if it's a C level draw, which you are, your equity is not that great, like you are. So I'll make the distinction first. When we have the category A hands, we usually want to be betting or we want to be raising as much as possible. When we have the category D hands, we want to be checking and we want to be folding as much as possible. When we have a B hand, we usually want to bet, but if we are faced with a bet, we usually want to call.
I would classify those as our pot controlling type hands. Hands that we don't want to put all the money in with, but that we definitely want to see a showdown with if possible.
Yeah, correct. And then the category C hands are kind of the hands where we want to get to the turn or the river so that we can see if we improve our hands. We hope we get to showdown, but if other people are betting against us more than twice, we probably want to be folding. If they bet against us twice, it really depends on which part of the C bracket it fits into. But what I'm saying is that if we have a draw that is kind of at a C, we can often be betting with them if check two, because it's very clear when we improve. And those hands make quite good semi-bluffs.
Yeah, I would like to introduce a term here. it becomes more functional to bet a draw than it would to bet a marginal strength pair. And the reason that it has a better function is because the draw really enjoys when it makes your opponent's hand fold. Whereas the marginal pair, it already had some showdown value over your opponent's showdown range. So it doesn't desire so much to make those hands fold. It's already beating them. It would just rather show down the hand, scoop the pot, realize its equity is the term that is most commonly used. So there is a strong function for a bluff that has a certain amount of equity to, we call it semi-bluffing. It can make a better hand in the opponent's range fold. And that's important because you never would be upset to bet a draw and see your opponent fold. And this is an important point, I think. It's not like your draw doesn't make a good hand so frequently that you're like begging that your opponent calls so that you can make your hand on a later street. The draw makes a good hand at a low frequency and a low enough frequency that we would want to see our opponent fold as the best result usually when we bet a draw.
All right, so I think the best thing we can do for the rest of this call is to give some specific examples of how this plays out. Because without specific examples, I think it's a little bit hard for many people to wrap their heads around things. So
sure.
I'll start first. The first example that I would give, so like I would say that I think the category A and category B stuff are relatively less complex. So like I'm gonna be skipping that for now and explain a little bit more about the B category hands. So an example would be like when, so if me and you are playing and you raise from the button and I call on the big blind, so I'm holding 10-9 and the board comes 10-7 deuce with a flush draw. I have top pair. So right now I'm out of position. I am usually checking here. I'm always checking here because Nick has the stronger range and I really have no reason to bet. So Nick, now when he decides to bet here, I think about, hey, my hand is definitely not in the category A. So like I don't want to be raising here. I have a marginal hand. So my hand is probably a category B hand. I would be calling here. However, if there's the same scenario, but Nick instead decides to check, and then now the turn comes, say a 5. So the board is now 10-7 5-2. Now, because my hand is category B, it is still strong enough that I want to put some money in the pot. I will bet this hand. So this would be a category B kind of hand. Another common hand category that I would have in this spot would be so let's say I had 8-7 now instead of 10-9. So I had second pair. It's the situation would happen here if I checked and Nick bet, I would still call because I guess my hand is more like in a category C here, sort of, but maybe in between a B and a C. And I want you to know that although we are talking about it in buckets, right, there's a lot of hands that are going to be kind of in the middle, that it doesn't clearly fit into one bucket. So how do I describe it? So right now, when I have 8-7, when Nick bets, I would call. But when he checks back and the turn comes at 5, I might not always be betting this hand here because my hand is less strong. Nick still has a lot of hands that he could check back that would beat my hand. And my hand has just lower equity.
So what I would say the main differences in the two examples Wayne just described is that in both situations, I raised pre-flop. So I am indicating that I have the stronger range. Wayne is responding by calling. In general, a key concept to remember when headed to the flop is that the stronger range should be doing most of the betting. Usually the weaker range is checking to the stronger range, which is why Wayne said he's checking pretty much every hand in his range on the 10-7 deuce flop. He's at what we would call a range disadvantage. Now, if I bet Wayne is going to call whether or not he has top pair or middle pair because they both are decent enough to put one bet into the pot. He wouldn't raise either of those hands because he wouldn't want to overextend himself, and in doing so, allow me to play such a tight range that he ends up what we call value owning. So his hand doesn't function well as a raising hand that wants to load tons of money into the pot. It functions well as a calling hand, and that is because my range has enough strong hands in it that Wayne should still be afraid of me, basically. At the point at which I check back the flop, basically I'm signaling enough weakness that now on the 5 turn, Wayne would look down at his top pair, 10, and say, oh, this is actually strong enough now to bet. The key thing to realize there is that Wayne is able to bet that top pair confidently because I signaled weakness by checking back the flop. My strong hands exit, a lot of my strong hands exit my range at that point, and so Wayne's top pair increases in relative value. So a lot of what decides whether or not your hand is shifting from a B to a C is how your opponent is responding throughout the hand. Because if your opponent is signaling weakness, well, then a hand like the 10-9 in this case is going to shift towards a hand that you're more interested in betting for value at some point, as opposed to playing defensively and just checking and calling down. So just as equities redistribute to the flop from pre-flop, equities also redistribute based on the action your opponent takes. If you hold a top pair on a flop like this and I check back, well, you're going to be more confident that your top pair is doing much better than if I were to bet into you. So it's important to keep an eye on, like, if you just want to talk about it in a rough heuristic, how many bets has my opponent put in at this point in the hand is generally a good gauge of how strong his range is. In this case, if I raise pre-flop and bet the flop, Wayne's going to be more concerned with his top pair, 10-9, than he would if I raise pre-flop and check the flop back. So I think it's a cool connection just in terms of the strength of your range changes depending on the action the strength of your hand changes depending on the action that I take on the flop. And you have to be ready to sort of calibrate that. And it's fairly intuitive. If I give up and check back the flop, your pairs become stronger. If I bet the flop, your pairs stay weaker.
Yeah, and I think without complicating matters too much, we have to make the distinguishment that if Nick checks back in that spot, it doesn't necessarily mean he always is weak. He can be trapping as well, and we it's just that the probability that he has a good hand reduces significantly. It's not completely eliminated.
Nice.
How about giving one last example before we wrap up? Do you have any examples that come to mind?
Sure, let's use a semi-bluff. So I'll use your example. Was it 10-7 deuce, the flop?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's pretend Wayne holds a hand like Jack 9 of hearts in that spot. It's a hand that could reasonably be in his calling range pre-flop, and it's a hand that makes quite a strong draw post-flop. He's got one overcard to the board. He's also got a gut shot straight and a flush draw. So he's got a lot of outs that he could potentially make strong hands with. But he doesn't currently have any showdown value, which is what makes this a unique type of quality hand. It's a hand that has a decent amount of equity because it can improve, but it would very much like to force me to fold because it doesn't have anything of real tangible value yet. So we classify this hand as a semi-bluff. In this case, it's quite a strong semi-bluff. And if I were Wayne in this spot, I would heavily consider check raising, meaning starting by checking, waiting for me to bet, and then instead of check calling, check raising that hand. You could check call it too. It certainly has enough equity. But it would be an example of how you could almost play that semi-bluff as though it were a strong value hand. And maybe that's not how – you don't necessarily have to look at it like that. I think the most direct way to look at it is just like, my hand could potentially make a very strong hand, and it will at some frequency, but I would enjoy stealing this pot right now. And so this hand now turns into a raising hand because it doesn't have any current showdown value, which is what makes it distinct from the medium or weak top pair hand, but it still has this strong equity component to it because of its potential to improve on future streets. So a cool option there is to play a check raise and force me to fold maybe a hand like ace king, which is a stronger hand in the moment, but not strong enough to withstand the types of hands that Wayne is check raising. Because remember, he's not just check raising draws, he's check raising some really good hands too. So it's a thing that's constantly happening every time a player bets or raises, is that there's a component of value and there's a component of bluffs. And in this situation, Wayne would be using this Jack 9 heart as a semi-bluff if he did choose to raise it.
Yeah. So just to give a clearer idea of how I would play other draws, so I would be raising Jack 9 here. I would be raising a lot of other flush draw hands because the board you're talking about here is 10-7 deuce 2 hearts, right? So a lot of my I think a good strategy to use is to play your draws relatively aggressively, mainly because we are recommending quite a tight range pre-flop. So most of the draws that we have will be pretty high quality draws, and I think a good heuristic is to just be playing aggressively when you have a good draw, and maybe a little bit more passively when you have a slightly weaker draw. So in this case, Jack 9 is a strong draw because we have one overcard, we have a gut shot, and we also have a flush draw. There are times that maybe we have, let's say we have 6-5 of hearts here, then that's only a weak draw. We can afford to play that hand a little bit more passively than Jack 9. I mean, there are different ways to play that hand, but I think this is the most resilient. It's the simplest to implement.
That's a good way of putting it, is the resilience, because like if we wanted to, I think it makes sense to add this point that it's definitely more difficult for your opponent to respond to the raise in a sensible way. Like a lot of what happens when you're up against a weak opponent is if you raise him in the spot, he will actually fold way too frequently. And that gives you a lot of incentive to start playing draws more aggressively. It's also a little bit harder to make a mistake on a future street if you just start by raising the flop right away, because for one, you'll just take it down more frequently. And for two, now that you've seized the initiative, you have the option to just continue to put one more bet in on the turn, see if he folds, as opposed to getting yourself in a more awkward spot. I always see check calling out of position with draws to be fairly awkward. And while there's certainly nothing wrong with it necessarily from a theoretical perspective, I would advise a new player to play the more resilient approach, like Wayne said, which is basically to generate more fold equity immediately when possible and try to end the hand right away.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty good summary of the different hand strengths and at least how they operate on that given texture.
Yeah. And I think just to make it clearer for people, that when we have Jack 9 in that spot and I choose to raise, if Nick calls, there's a different, like the turn and the river will come, right? Oftentimes, if I hit a pair on the turn, like I hit my Jack on my 9, I would probably, now my hand strength kind of changes a little bit. If you see, I actually have showdown value, and now I can, now checking is actually it's an option that I would strongly consider. Maybe I'm more likely to check if I hit the 9 than if I hit the Jack, because now if I hit the Jack, I have even, like, my hand has, I could be value betting their hand as well.
I think that's a cool point, because it ties back into why we would start by checking and calling a hand like 8-7 on a 10-7 deuce flop. It's because we have a marginal strength hand. We were bluffing the Jack 9, semi-bluffing it by check raising flop, but then we improve by making a 9 on the turn, so it becomes more like the 8-7 hand was on the flop. We start to play it more like a marginal showdown hand than a draw. You could still bet it, but you could also check call it, which is something that you wouldn't really have the option of doing. You wouldn't really be able to play a check call unless you picked up that pair for showdown value.
Yeah.
So it's a good example to sort of show how your strategy changes as the quality of your equity shifts from pre-flop to flop to turn to river.
Yeah, and in the instance that we don't hit a pair, so it's just a we don't improve at all. So we don't hit a straight, we don't pick up any news, we don't pick up a flush. Then very often, because we seize the initiative, it is still pretty plus EV to bet this situation a lot. So my recommendation is to continue with the aggression after you check raise and you miss on the turn. Generally speaking,
that's what I think is easy about playing the draw that way. Not only is it more resilient in the sense that you can just force fold equity from your opponent immediately, but it's also a pretty clear plan. I'm going to follow up with one more turn bet, and then I have the option to bluff the river too if I want, but I don't really find myself in any difficult spots. Like, I'm not going to find myself in a difficult turn spot. If I don't improve, I'm going to semi-bluff one more time. If I improve to a flush or a straight, that's awesome. Now I get to build a big pot and win a big pot. So I think polarizing the hand in that way by raising the flop is a way to simplify the hand while also maximizing the resilience of your hand, like Wayne said. Should we wrap there?
All right. Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, it was fun as always.
Catch you guys back here for the next extension of our post-flop discussion.
Yeah, looking forward.